my name is Dr. Jill Harrington. I am the creator and lead editor of the textbook superhero brief, The Transformative Power of Loss. I am also an assistant professor at Marymount University in Arlington, Virginia. I have been teaching as an adjunct associate professor for the last 5 years, and I taught a class on chronic illness and disabilities. That was a class that I co-taught for a senior professor. And then I have been doing at a small school in Washington, D.C. in a clinical mental health program. I created their Introduction to Grief Counseling and also trauma and loss class that I've been teaching the last 5 years. So in my teaching demonstration, as well as the research I intend to pursue, is going to be focused around bereavement and end of life. I'm particularly interested, but majority of my work has been in a young adult to younger adult population, although I've looked at grief and loss across lifespan. And that's also a deep interest of mine. So I'll be pursuing, hopefully, some research as well as some continued scholarship and writing in the field of Thanatology, which is Thanatology, if you don't know where it came from, really comes from the Greek word thanatos, which means death. And ology, put the ology on the end of anything, and that means the study of. So it's the study of death and dying. I got into this field, you had asked me many years ago. I was sort of like debating whether I wanted to go to law school or psychology school, or I then was volunteering at the time for a place at the American Cancer Society, and all these oncology social workers. So that kind of was my segue into social work, was meeting all these. When I found, as I worked on oncology, first of all, you're a cocktail killer at a party, and I hate to say that because when you tell people you work in this field, people treat you like the Grim Reaper, and you say you work in the cancer field, people do too. They kind of step away from you. But what I found in oncology was that, yes, we saw folks that were definitely very ill to people through cancer survivorship. And I discovered that there were these really wonderful people who actually worked in the oncology field. And I was really drawn to the work because of the dedication of the nurses and the doctors, and also a lot of the patients that I worked with were always my greatest teachers in life, not about so much death, even facing death, but about life and how, having something like a life-limiting illness or something that could become potentially life-threatening can really be an existential moment for people, and how people can kind of transform in their pain, but as well helping to assist people through some of the darkest of times. I just saw a lot of what I would say unsung heroes in the healthcare field. And that kind of drew me in to really wanting to work in oncology. It's difficult. I was told by my supervisor at the time when I was in my grad school program that I had, she felt was a gift for being able to sit in hell with somebody, and that not everybody, it's not a skill you can teach. And that really, it's almost like a person who's a gifted athlete that's kind of born with it and then it's honed. I believe that there are people in this world who are gifted to being able to sit in the presence and companion other people's pain. That kind of struck me. I didn't know that about myself. And my ability, I guess, to be with people in some of their darkest times and not take away their pain, but help them in those moments of being able to either live through it, die through it, or sometimes even bring comfort and help through it as a resource of support. And so, back when I was in oncology, we were seeing a lot in cancer survivorship. So I happened to work in blood cancers, which was with a young adult. Blood cancers do affect, there are certain age groups that affects, and my unit happened to be mainly the young adults, working with Hodgkin's lymphoma and leukemia. So it became an area of professional interest of mine because I saw families in which people did survive their cancer, and some people, unfortunately died at a young age. And they were just different things that affected young families. And so it became an interest area of mine to work with the young adult to younger adult population. And then when I made a professional decision to sort of move across the continuum of care to bereavement, end of life to bereavement, I began working with surviving military families. And a lot of military families, the deaths are of young service members with young families. So there are different issues that influence grief across the lifespan. Some young adult issues can be if you lose a spouse. Sometimes people were just the thoughts of the future hopes or dreams of maybe starting a family or all those things you're beginning to maybe start as a couple. And it really depends on who you are in relation to the person who's died. I saw a lot of young adult siblings who, when a sibling died, and then also it depends on circumstance of death. A lot of circumstances of death that are traumatic or have a violent element or an element of, volition, of maybe self-infliction. There are different issues that present themselves. And that was also something that arose in oncology that became an interest of mine. We did have a small percentage of cancer patients who died by suicide. And the grief that I was seeing with families was very different than that of a natural death. And that's not to say that grief, people are not affected immensely from natural death or unnatural death through grief and profound loss. It's just some of the issues were different, very different. The concept of superhero grief actually came out of, I have a love for the visual arts, particularly movies, films, comics. I was a comic kid and growing up in the 70s in New York. I have my own story with a little bit of interaction from the creator of Batman, Bob Kane, when one of my sibling had a life-threatening illness, and the gentleness and kindness of him drawing us sketches. And that really influenced me as a kid. And I have a son who is a young adult on the autism spectrum. And we've had our own losses in our life. And with my son and my daughter, teaching them about grief and loss was really through movies and films and using these characters. And if you know anything about autism, a lot of people on the spectrum, really visual storytelling is really important ways for them to be able to learn the world around them. And so, there's a long history. That's a whole podcast in and of itself. But I had been using superhero narratives, and which are really just mythological narratives. They're part of our modern day mythology. And most of our mythology are human stories about the human condition. And these are superheroes that were created by humans, for humans, by humans, to kind of teach us about the challenges in the world. A lot of our mythological creatures were during oral storytelling about how do we discover, try to understand war, death, trauma, and natural disasters, the natural, Mother Nature. And so our modern mythology are really these superhero stories. And there's a lot of lessons and loss that we can learn. But we also have to be careful because it's fiction. And as I also teach my son and my clients and everybody else that, the one thing about a lot of the superheroes, even though they could skip timelines and nobody ever really dies, if you really look at it in its true origin, Superman, who's Kal-El, who El meaning God in Hebrew, was really made after the story of Moses. Even with all Superman's powers, he cannot bring back his deceased parents. And so there is a lesson in all of that Superman, even with all his strength, has kryptonite. He has his vulnerabilities. So we can be both strong and fragile at the same time. And these lessons in loss, there's lessons that teach us we could be both strong and fragile. In our most fragile moments in life, it's important for counselors and therapists or peer supporters or friends to recognize this little small, what we could think are small strengths. And part of the whole concept with superhero grief was death could be very understandably so, very frightening to talk about. I often tell people, just because I'm a thanatologist and I know that part of my awakening is that I know I am going to die. I know people, doesn't mean I don't like it, just because I accept it. It doesn't mean I don't work on my own fear And it's a very frightening thing to think about, talk about. There is a healthy amount of denial. If we lived every day thinking we're going to die, we wouldn't be able to be in the present moment. So it keeps us less anxious in a way, and also kind of healthy, engaging in life a bit. You can't be dying while you're living all the time. It's just sometimes you can't be present and living if you're continually in fear about dying, your own existential crisis. What I was going to say is that it's a very sometimes unapproachable topic, and superhero grief, my hope for that was to make something that's difficult to talk about a little bit more approachable, and by using relatable characters that span, multi-generations across, very multiculturally, and very diverse and inclusive. So I am hoping that it is a way to help make a more grief-informed world. That's where I started about 18 to 19 years ago, working. I went from, prolonged sort of illness, or what we say, more expected health illnesses, although I hate to put it all in that category, because you can get a life-threatening diagnosis and be dead very quickly. So there's a sudden, unexpected nature sometimes to illness as well, too, or sudden illness and sudden death. So I'm going to kind of put it into different categories. And that's not to say that categorically there could be traumatic elements in all loss, no matter how somebody dies. I've seen people with medical illnesses have to witness family members really undergoing what I call barbaric, in a way, medical treatments, or wasting away and dying and suffering, which can have elements of post-traumatic stress to family members having to bear witness to the pain and suffering of their loved ones. But I'm going to break down, death into, we have 4 different categories on a death certificate. And, we have homicide, which homicide is, homo sapien, meaning man, side, meaning kill. So that's when people kill people. You have suicide, or self-inflicted death, which is when the death is self-inflicted. You have natural causes and accidental causes. So that's across the United States, at least here in our reporting, you've got 4 different categories of death. So, I don't want to say typically with natural causes that there are some natural causes that are sudden. It's like a sudden heart attack, or a sudden aneurysm, or some sudden illness where people die. And the suddenness of the death, a lot of what's presented in grief is the unexpected nature of it. And so there's no preparation. Oftentimes you'll hear sometimes family members say that, my grandmother died of a sudden stroke in her sleep, and I'm glad that she didn't have pain and suffering, but the unexpected nature, she was here today, gone tomorrow. So the fact that it can arise in us anxiety about how fast life can change, and also the fragility of life, but also it does not give us time for preparation, to mentally prepare. And we are creatures of hellos and goodbyes. That's sort of how we're socialized, and part of our human nature is we have these, when people come into the world, and you have a lot of people who want to go see a baby come into the world, right? They want to be there when a new family member is arriving, and they want to say hello, when they want to see that person. But, when people are dying, there is something about, and Dr. Ted Reinierson often talks about this with his narrative work in restorative retelling. There's something about being able to be present in the story that gives us some kind of narrative cohesion. When someone dies suddenly and unexpectedly, think about like a character in a book or a movie or something. A person's in the story and all of a sudden they're just taken right out. So there's something about that disrupts our narrative, our life narrative. And that could make us question. I say sudden death usually makes us question the world, our assumptive world. And the assumptive world coming out of a lot of work with Dr. Niemeyer and a lot of other folks who I can't draw on right now. Everybody who's done assumptive world work, I believe Dr. Rando has as well too. But their assumptive world is the world that we perceive to be our world, our views, our cultures, our beliefs, the people where we grow up with, the people that connect us to the world, because it's about connection. Without people to sort of orient us and connect us, who are we in this world? And human beings don't do very well in isolation. Some do, but how does our world, how do we have meaning? Who are we? What purpose do we have? And usually that's through connection, and that connection, our assumptive world is made up of how we were raised, the people we're raised around, our cultures, our beliefs, our experiences. And so when sudden things happen and your life changes on a dime, it really makes us question our entire world and a sense of ourself. Like, who am I now? It goes back to Erickson's, like, who am I now in this new world? I mean, Superman always says to Lois Lane, we'll talk about superhero grief here, is that you are my world. If you listen to any of if you read any of the comics, or if you listen to a lot of the Superman movies and films, it always says to Lois, you are my world. And that's who people are to us. They are part of our world. And when our world begins to shift and change, and especially very dramatically, and suddenly we could feel very disoriented and very scared. Who am I now? Who is this world now? Dr. Tom Adeg talks about, he came up with the whole conception of, loss really presents to us this, I wouldn't say opportunity, but we're challenged with loss because we have to relearn a whole new world. A parent who maybe has an only child and loses a child. What is my world like now without my child? What is my world like now as a spouse without my partner in life? What is the world like now without a sibling, the person you've probably known the longest in your life? So loss challenges us to really relearn this new world, and it can be really scary. And then, that's really sudden death really challenges a lot of that. Traumatic death, like suicide, and I'll say self-inflicted or death by suicide or overdose. But when death has the biggest component of an influencing factor when people die from self-infliction is the self-inflicted nature of the death. Suicide kind of can be a very confusing death for those who are bereaved by suicide. And it often puts people on a path that's still a mystery to us. Even though people have been dying by suicide since probably all humanity has started, it's still a mystery to us. There are many different pathways to suicide. It often beckons the question, why? There are influencing issues that Dr. Jack Jordan, he has done tremendous work in the last 40 to 50 years, clinical work, working with suicide bereaved families. And, suicide bereavement can bring influencing issues that you may not see with the ways that other people die, ways in which other people die. Although similar sometimes to accidental death or natural death, sometimes people do ask the question, why? But with suicide death, that the prominence of that is often very predominant, that searching for the meaning of why and the question of why. Blame and responsibility. Oftentimes survivors believe they have some type of perceived responsibility. If only I had, just called one more time, if only I had not had that fight, constant double second guessing and questioning themselves. Suicide survivors often go into investigation mode. And that is a very normal and natural path for anyone. When I work with surviving families of suicide, I particularly, have worked with all different relationship types, but, most recently in my working with parents, I had newly bereaved parents, and they were questioning the whole questioning of why, and had heard in a group from somebody that said, don't get caught in this whole why. And I kind of validated that for them and saying that it is very normal and natural to want to know why. Sometimes part of the journey in this, or part of the struggle in this, is that you may never find out why or have the answers to your whys. But that's something, having to go through that path is very natural for anyone who's been bereaved, that has had somebody suddenly ripped away from them. You know, if our loved one died in a hospital under mysterious causes, we would want to know why. So that questioning of why is often very prominent with suicide survivors. The feeling of being rejected. Sometimes spouses feel this very heavily, that, you know, that my spouse chose maybe death over me. Or a family member feels like, why wasn't my love strong enough to keep somebody in this world? Thinking that suicide is a choice. You know, we often talk about that in the field of suicidology. There's debate whether it's a choice or we know it's a decision. But oftentimes, sometimes I don't want to categorize it, because I believe, and we talk about, there are many different pathways to suicide, just like cancer is a word for 1,000 different diseases. You know, every person who dies by suicide has their own pathway there. So it's really important not to just put everything, generalize and put it all in a box, because it is as unique. Our experiences, especially death, is as unique as our own fingerprint. There may be some commonalities, but it's really important for us to know that, you know, how people die by suicide is very unique to them. And, you know, for some people, they have the answer to that question why. It could be after a long-term struggle with mental illness. It could be a long-term struggle with addiction or self-destructive behavior. We do know that the biggest risk factor for suicide is a previous suicide attempt. But when people die by suicide, and sometimes family members, even after a long struggle with mental health, there's still the suddenness and the shock of the death. Maybe not as they're working through their grief, maybe not so much the element of surprise. When a suicide comes out of the blue with their shock and surprise, that can be extremely jarring. So, you know, a lot of families that have had a violent death or a sudden death, there's elements of trauma there. So you're working kind of, you know, what's happening to you is both trauma and grief at the same time. And we don't have enough experienced clinicians or peer support orders, people even trained in the dual influences of traumatic elements and grief at the same time. We're still, unfortunately, society is still subscribing to the very outdated and very, in a way, unintentionally biased, but, you know, Kubler-Ross model of death and dying. Even Dr. Kubler-Ross said before she died that her model was now outdated. And it was really looking at folks that were in the dying process. It really looks at some people's either cognitive or emotional expressions before they were dying. So, but she was really the first to open up the doorways to discuss death and dying and made it more mainstream, and also brought it into medical schools. And she was a huge advocate of the hospice movement. So we want to honor her work, but, you know, continuing to just focus on the 5 stages that are very prescriptive, and also really didn't look at death and dying from a multicultural perspective. And that's what I mean by the inherent bias a little bit in there, is that it's almost like saying that we haven't evolved. Like, you know, we used to think the earth was flat, and then science kind of progressed. And now we know the sun doesn't revolve around the earth. We know that the earth revolves around the sun, and that the earth isn't flat, that it's actually round. So she began the discussion, but yet because society doesn't really like to talk about death and dying, it's very neat and prescriptive to say there can be 5 stages, but it can really set people up for a whole bunch of failure, because grief isn't about going through 5 stages or 5 prescriptive either cognitive or emotional responses to death. So I think COVID kind of cracked open grief, and the work of Dr. Darcy Harris who really studied and brought forward, has been a champion for non-death losses. And so when you had the world now suffering from grief, from death losses and non-death losses, losses from restrictions at home, losses from a sense of a social identity, losses from a sense of, there were so many people had financial losses, people had job shift losses, people had existential crises, which led to losses of an assumptive world. So when the world was in the same storm, we weren't all in the same boat. Okay. So this was sort of a same storm, but some people had different boats than others. I think it cracked open this whole commonality that of all the human experiences, what is common to what binds us as human beings is that we will suffer loss and we will suffer death loss. So that kind of cracked open a little bit of the fact that grief is very fundamental to being human. And if you really think about it, I've done an article, I got interviewed for an article on WandaVision, which people watched because we were all under lock and key during the pandemic and not a lot to do. And so you had the whole world tuning into television shows. And, WandaVision may not really have been watched by that many people in the whole world, but became a phenomenon and has, because we were all sort of a captive audience, and it became very popular. But the series itself focuses, I can do a whole podcast just on that, but it focuses very deeply on Wanda Maximoff's grief. Intense grief and profound grief. And it's just interesting that resonated with a lot of people in the audience. So it kind of cracked open the idea that, wow, I'm grieving, and I'm grieving not just losses of death of folks, but there's all of these other losses that I've had, and the loss of, my freedom and the law. So it really began a dialogue, a grief dialogue around the world. And it has opened up in terms of education. We used to just have a couple of places you can go to for grief and loss education. Now there are many, many different organizations and lots of different psychological organizations offering courses in grief and loss. But people were kind of craving information on wanting to really know what was going on with them. So there are many more articles and newspapers. I think it's really important to also put a disclaimer on the fact that because people believe that loss and grief is universal to humanity, that anybody can help someone who's grieving. That's like saying to me that having a child is a natural process for women. People identify as women. It can be natural. And some people can have a baby without the assistance of anybody. Sometimes, a lot of times people cannot. And so there are a lot of people out there who say that they are trained in working with loss and grief, or who have their own idea because they went through their own loss experience. And without really the training that is required, the skill that is required, the knowledge that's required, they could actually do a lot more harm to people than good. And so what I'd like to say is that we do need much more trained educators as well as clinicians. It's a skill that not every clinician has. And I often teach my students who, until you work, and it's continual work, on your own death anxiety and your own ability to sit in people's pain with them and not try to fix it. Death loss is it's unfixable. So, when we work in trauma is about sometimes managing or extinguishing the symptoms of trauma. There is no fixing someone who's a loved one has died or friends died. So it's really about managing the pain of loss. And you're right, you said before in your question that at the root of all loss is a challenge to our identity. It can challenge us to the core. It depends on our attachment to what we've lost, what kind of meaning that holds, and that can often make us feel that loss. Either maybe that's a loss that I had and I don't feel that deeply over it, and not everybody grieves the death of somebody. It's about our attachment and our bond, or a perceived attachment and bond, just like people who've grieved celebrities that they've never met. They've been influenced by their music or their work. So it becomes a part of our identity. So loss hits us at the root of our identity. And so when we've had a loss that really challenges our identity, it's like living in these two worlds, who I was before the loss and who am I now? And it's often living in a duality. Like, ask a bereaved parent if they're ever going to, or should they ever feel the same as they did before their child died. Ask them if they live daily with feelings of loss and trying to live life. So it's about living in this dual identity, the dual emotions, and trying to balance some way forward.